Right, so greetings, hello everyone. Welcome back to the Philosophy Club here in the middle of France in the department called La Creuse, which is a beautiful rural department in the dead geographical centre of France. So, and in the heart of what was Gaul in the old days of the Druids. So it's a great honour to be able to be based here, speaking from here. And France I associate with philosophy. It was a cradle of the intellectual life of Europe since very early on, actually. In the medieval times, obviously the University of Paris was one of the great centres for thinkers throughout Europe. But before that, in the Druid times, places like Chartres had deep, thinkers. And that morphed into the Cathedral School at Chartres, which was one of the most important intellectual centres in Europe. Rudolf Steiner, in his esoteric histories of Europe, says the School of Chartres was one of the most important sanctuaries of Neoplatonic thought, because there were some very wise people there. And then Paris became the centre after that. So, anyway, it's an honour to be here. Let's start with a few thoughts about the situation in the world. So yes, the war tragically in Gaza and Israel continues, and I've just had a meeting today of the International Restorative Council with my colleague Priscilla Prutzmann and others, discussing, law alone is not perhaps the answer. I mean, the International Court of Justice in The Hague is going to make a finding in the next week or two about whether this looks like a genocidal onslaught by Israel. And either way, whatever their judgment, it's going to really annoy and disappoint many people. That's the nature of law. It's very bipolar. It's extreme, either this or that, guilty or innocent. Whereas there's a sort of middle way, I think, between absolutely guilty and absolutely innocent. I mean, for instance, who's actually guilty of genocide? Is it the whole Israeli people? No, of course not. It would be the war faction around the Likud party and the extremists around Netanyahu, who've been in power on and off for far too long. Netanyahu's been prime minister for a very long time. And he's always been promoting belligerence against the Palestinians. He and his party have stood absolutely against the idea of a Palestinian state. And, it goes back to the formation of Likud, and it represents sort of intransigent faction in Israeli society, which I don't believe represents the true Israel at all, who to me are amazing people who do not want a weaponization of relations with Palestine, such as Likud and Netanyahu have given. So if anyone's responsible for these genocidal actions in Gaza, it's not the Israeli people, it's the faction around Netanyahu. And I think people are beginning to realize that, and there are now moves to have him face his court. He has committed crimes, even under Israeli law, let alone whether he's committed war crimes. Now you can say, yes, well, he may be the main guy, but what about the Israeli army? Surely they're guilty of genocide. Yeah, but they're following orders, they're conscripted, they're forced to do this, you can argue. So their guilt is less. And then the Palestinian faction, Hamas, obviously an extremist faction. But to say that all members of Hamas or all people who voted for Hamas are guilty of war crimes is, again, an extremist overreaction. So now law can't distinguish between these subtleties. And that's where we need what's called restorative justice. So in the work of the International Restorative Council, what we're looking at is an alternative approach to legalism, which is to have justice as an ideal between people in their relationships. What we've got to do is restore amity and good relations between the Israeli people as a whole, the Jewish people around the world, and the Palestinian people around the world and in Palestine. It's a tall order. We have to restore their actually their amity for each other. Many great Jewish philosophers, thinkers, early Zionists wanted to live in harmony with the Palestinians. They always said, we want to be here in peace. We've come not to supplant you or threaten you. And the Balfour Declaration said nothing should be done to, to threaten or intimidate the local populations. Now that's all been utterly torn up by Likud and Netanyahu and their sort of belligerence. So looking beyond Netanyahu's reign of terror, and Hamas's reign of terror, how can we restore justice between these peoples? I've been studying this philosophically, and I've come across an important rabbi, Rabbi Hirsch, who was a very important rabbi in Germany in the 19th century, who he defined what it is to be Jewish and what it is to have that faith. And he pointed out something very important. He said that, God, in the infinite mystery of the divine intelligence, planned that the Torah should be revealed when the Jews were wandering in the desert on a mountain in the middle of Sinai through a prophet Moses, and they were a wandering people at the time. And according to Rabbi Hirsch, this is because God wanted to get away from the idea that a revelation has to be attached to a particular land or landscape. Because the revelation is independent of place, it's universal, and it's a sort of a download from the divine intelligence. And I think what's happened is that after that, and this is before the establishment of Israel, long before that, there became this almost like an idolatry, that it's the land itself that is God's gift to the Jewish people exclusively. And that, I think, is a mistake intellectually. Rabbi Hirsch would agree with me. The divine law, the Torah, has come actually for all mankind as one of the many revelations. And its ethical import, things like thou shalt not kill, one of the most important of the Ten Commandments, given at the Torah's birth, is universal. It should be for all of us. But there's come about this idolatry, and according to Hirsch, if he were alive today, he'd say that Zionism is a form of idolatry because it's confusing fidelity to God and the divine law with fidelity to the ownership of a land, which is a kind of, egotism. I own this land. And what Hirsch would say, and many of the most orthodox Jews are saying, the most religious people, are saying that this idea of Zionism being a state like any other state is actually a blasphemy. It's against God's will, and the landscape should be shared by all peoples. It's not associated with a particular state. And some of the greatest Jewish settlers in the land were anarchists who didn't want a state at all. If you read Proudhon's War and Peace, great French intellectual, one of the founders of anarchism in the modern era, he said states always make war. We have to outgrow the state and its armies and its intelligence agents and its torture chambers and its weaponized cruelty. We have to go beyond that to a state of humanity, of universalism. And I think Proudhon was right. He was a visionary who came from near here in France. So, how are we going to, get there from here? Because we're in a world of nation states that are belligerent, warring with each other, and misusing modern technology to promote their own ideology and their own worldview against everyone else. Instead of what we're trying to do here in the European Union, which is emphasise our commonality. We're all brothers and sisters in one continent, and we can travel and work in each other's countries, whether you're Portuguese or French or Belgian or Dutch or Polish or any other nationality, Irish, and hopefully English when we rejoin again, Scottish and Welsh. What's common to us all should be a sort of set of universal values: human rights, freedom of speech, the right to a certain degree of, social security and all this kind of thing is embedded into the European Union Charter. And that should, I think, be for all nations and different regions. I'd like to see a similar thing in Africa, in the Americas, and in Asia, to replace belligerent nationalism. That was the idea of the European Union, which I think is still valid and important, that we live together in harmony. Okay, how are we going to do that? Well, let's see what gets in the way of it. And can we use the philosophies of the world to bring hope, to spread enlightenment and universalism? I believe so as a philosopher and coordinator of Philosophers for Peace here in Europe. I think it's our duty and our mission and our right to see what's universal in philosophy and try and find ways of applying that to peacemaking and conflict resolution. So let's have a look at the periodic table, which I've devised, for those not familiar with it, of all the different religions and philosophies in the world. And what we're going to look at is, we'll select two, and we'll see, I'll say something about their origin and history and all that. And then we'll compare and contrast them. So, so let's go first. Sophia, if you'd like to choose one.
Consciously or subconsciously?
It's up to you. You can do it blind, like a rune choice.
Philosophy and chemistry, 156.
Okay, that's great. And if you want to choose one as well, do it again randomly if you want, blind.
No.
Or you've got a choice. Okay.
Philosophy, biology, medicine, and sport.
Oh, okay. You've gone for 159. Okay. Well, this is great. So we've got two from the bottom line, which is the philosophy line, and I'll do the 159 first, which is the biology and medicine one, and then I'll come back to the chemistry one. So this is an important, box. As long as human beings have been around, our interest in medicine has been there. We've always had healers, shamans who specialise in healing, right from the most primitive times. One of the functions of the shamans in early tribes is always to be the healer, the one that can, cure the one that is injured or hurt. In the shamanic times of prehistory, it was often associated with spiritual work. So the shaman would want to investigate what's the spiritual cause of this illness that's presenting itself. And they would develop very elaborate kind of almost ceremonial ways of cleansing or purifying the person that's ill and removing the spiritual causes. So this could include all kinds of things, ritual ceremonies, blowing tobacco if they're in the American continent, and song, chant, prayer. Often the shaman went into a spiritual wrestling match with the forces that were causing the illness, which were regarded as from another world zone, and had to be then wrestled and taken out so that the person could be set free again. But also they used herbs, roots, leaves, potions, which had a medicinal curative process. I just want to say one thing. It occurred to me over the weekend, actually. I was thinking about Israel. Jacob, who was given the name Israel after a very strange experience when he wrestled with God or with an angel. It's not quite clear in the biblical text of Genesis what actually happened. It occurred to me as a sort of lightning bolt that this is a shamanic experience that Jacob had, wrestling with an angel. Come on, that's what shamans do. They wrestle with angels. And he was doing a sort of curing process for the tribe, the collective, which would become his descendants. And he was then named Israel as a result. So that's his shamanic name. I think that academics in comparative religions should reclaim Jacob as a shaman. And if you revision that, you can say, that's what Israel's all about. It's that tribe where that shaman wrestled with God, and they're still doing it. But so, in a sense, we need Jacob to come back and complete that work of healing, purification, catharsis, which is what shamans do. They heal, right? Whereas instead, what's happened is it's gone a bit haywire, and I'm sure Jacob will be appalled at what's been done in his name, i.e., in the name of Israel. It's a shamanic name. It's a spiritual name. Okay, so healing is a very ancient thing, and I've studied the history of medicine. I taught a course on the history of medicine and spirituality at the University of Oxford some moons years ago, and I went into prehistoric medicine, and then from that came the medical traditions of Sumeria, Babylon, and the Mesopotamian region. And we know this because we have texts in cuneiform that have come down. A lot of medical texts have been found in ancient libraries dug up by archaeologists. What's interesting is those Babylonian and Sumerian and Assyrian and Akkadian texts are very shamanic. Certain priests in the temples would specialize in medicine, and they learned certain particular prayers which they would recite given particular kinds of illnesses like epilepsy, or somebody had terrible headaches, or all kinds of different illnesses. And they also made lists of all these illnesses, and they gave examples of the kinds of prayers you should say. They also did what we would call ritual exorcisms. So they would cast a circle or a five-pointed star on the floor, light lamps, and then put the patient in the middle, and then recite prayers and so on over them. And now whether it actually had a magical healing effect or a psychosomatic one, almost it's irrelevant. It has a healing effect, this kind of thing. Psychosomatic medicine does work, as they've discovered in modern trials where they give people, particular pills plus blank pills. The blank pills also work if the patient thinks they're real pills. So it's mind over matter at work here. The same in Egypt, because the medical tradition of ancient Egypt is very profound. We've got things like the Ebers papyrus and others with medical recipes, spells. They were doing delicate brain surgery, trepanning. Egyptian medicine was a very high art already by 2000 BC, really a long time ago. And the gods want us to be healed. This is the first thing to say. They don't want us to suffer. So the priest sages of Egypt and Babylon were the forerunners of the Hippocratic tradition. So the Greeks were latecomers to this, but they got involved very, in a committed way. The Greeks travelled to Egypt, Babylon. Their sages realised the wisdom of these ancient Near Eastern peoples. And I've been to Kos, where Hippocrates set up the first Greek healing temple associated with the god Asclepius. Now, Asclepius was the son of Apollo, and he is regarded as the founder of scientific medicine through Hippocrates, who saw himself as a disciple of Asclepius. And I've been to the temple in Kos, where the Asclepion became a haven for Hippocratic medicine. There was a garden associated where they grew herbs, and they tested and trialed these empirically. So it was the beginning of scientific medicine. Hippocrates said, take a diagnosis of the patient, write down the symptoms, try different remedies and recipes, see what works, record it, pass that on to your disciples. So gradually you had this idea of scientific medicine developing. But they still believed healing is ultimately the work of the gods, because the first thing you did was the patient would sleep in the temple of Asclepius, and they would then be interviewed at first light, and their dreams would be recorded. And it was believed that the gods would send both the diagnosis and a possible cure through dream imagery, symbology. And it's interesting that in the work of Carl Jung, that idea has been revived. In modern psychoanalysis, this idea that the dreams can heal, it's just going back to what Hippocrates and Asclepius and the ancient Greeks knew 2,500 years ago. So forward on a bit, one of the most important medical lineages, therefore, was from the Asclepius line. And the Greek doctors believed they were descendants, literally, of Asclepius, the son of Apollo. And Aristotle's father was the physician to the Macedonian court at the time of Philip the Great, the father of Alexander the Great. So Aristotle grew up in a medical family. And so when he was sent by his father to the academy in Athens to study philosophy under Plato, he brought with him all that love of medicine and healing. And Aristotle's motivation for becoming a philosopher was to heal. But not just individuals one-to-one, like of broken legs or something, but nations and peoples and cities and classes of their rivalry and conflict and violence, which is why he invented political science. So if you realise that Aristotle was actually a doctor applying medical thought to social problems and social illness, suddenly all of Aristotle's work falls into place. And one of the most important things he did was basically found biology as a discipline. He said, how can we heal humans and animals, because he was interested in veterinary science, unless we know what animals are? Why do we have the shapes we have? Why do we all have a head, and legs and arms? And so he began the comparative study of animals, which we call zoology. And he wrote a book, De Animalia, exploring the different shapes and the strangeness of animals. He almost got to a theory of evolution. He didn't quite articulate it as such. He said what makes an animal is that they all have a teleological function. That is, they're all purposive creatures. We operate because we want to achieve a goal, whereas a stone, a rock, doesn't. It just sits there and does its rockiness thing. Whereas animals get up and, they want to find food, they want to find shelter, they want to find a mate. They want to, in human terms, we want to know stuff. Aristotle said we are animals that want to know things, and that finding knowledge is our purpose, or wisdom ultimately. So anyway, biology is an offshoot of this Greek intellectual precocity of Aristotle, which was very closely linked to medicine. And in the history of thought ever since, you've had biology and medicine keeping pace with each other. When biologists discovered the human cell, thanks to the microscope invented in Holland, not till the 1600s, by Leeuwenhoek, that invention spread like wildfire among biologists, and Robert Hooke of the Royal Society, Secretary of the Royal Society in London, got hold of it. He wrote an amazing book on the nature of the cell, doing really minute drawings of what these cells are like, little creatures, he called them. And then, of course, doctors realised that so illness, when it takes hold of a body, like, say, gangrene or something horrible, it's impacting on the cells of the body. And so they began to study medicine more scientifically, what is going on with the pathology of these cells. And then from there you come to microbial theory and, the whole of modern medicine took off. So this link between biology and medicine is profound, and they're all in this box. The link to sport is there because sports science as a discipline is about what the body can do in its maximum performance. How's the fastest we can run, or the longest we can dive, and the fastest we can swim. So now if you want to be a sports scientist, you have to understand biology. They train and teach you how metabolism works, what kind of optimal diets, what training you need, how you can boost your body's strength and so on. So that's why sport is tucked into that box. And it's a fascinating box there. And there are new discoveries being made all the time in biology and in medicine, of course. I belong to the Scientific and Medical Network, which is a network of new paradigm thinkers that are saying that the body's not only material cells. There's something intelligent. There's something conscious about matter, and the way that the incredible complexity of the cell is just beyond random chance events in the Darwinian traditional model. There's something, magical, mysterious, metaphysical about the way living bodies cohere with the cells. And that's a very interesting sort of new form of research that's going on. People like Prigogine and others have done experiments to prove that cells are very, very intelligent, actually. Okay, so that's that box. What's the link to chemistry? That's box 156. Well, chemistry is from an Arabic term, al-chemi, which was the science of matter and how the compounds of material forms would interact. And it comes from an ancient Egyptian root, al-chem, meaning the knowledge, the black arts, the knowledge of the black region of Egypt. Because in ancient Egypt, black was a sacred colour. It's the colour of the pupil of the eye, which is dark, to absorb the light. The black skin of the African tribes of southern Egypt was seen as holy and sacred, and the land's soil was black in colour. So the Africans of Egypt loved the blackness of their land, and the wisdom that it generated over the centuries, millennia actually, was very profound. And they had a detailed knowledge of matter and how it interacts and creates medicines and other things. But what they lacked, and what modern chemistry developed, was an idea of the chemical elements. So in the Middle Ages, which came from the ancient times, there was an idea that matter is made of the four elements: earth, air, fire, and water, and they interact. And that was associated with Empedocles, a Greek philosopher. But it was later, with the work of Dalton and Robert Boyle and other more modern chemical thinkers, that the realization was that matter is made of elements, chemical elements. And they began to study this in detail. And eventually Mendeleev, a great Russian chemist, put together the periodic table of the elements, of which this is then a clone, right? And now we know there are, I think it's 118 chemical elements, and we now know that they're all made of the same atoms, the same energy, but the energy is compounded in different ways and in different numbers. So hydrogen, oxygen, nitrogen, carbon, all the different elements, they're variations of the same thing, like a Bach musical piece. All the same notes, but they're all jumbled around in slightly different structures, which creates the difference between a liquid and a solid, or between different manifestations of matter. Chemistry is fascinating, obviously, and one of my favourite chemists, a man called Glenn Seaborg, he was an American scientist who helped define the elements, and he discovered a few of the new ones, living in California in the 20th century. And so, but chemistry, and little word of warning here is that knowledge can be misused, as Aristotle knew, as all philosophers know. Chemistry can be misapplied, and you can create chemical weapons. For instance, you can create Zyklon B, which was the poison gas used in Auschwitz to exterminate, people in en masse in the concentration camps. That was the work of German chemists, right? And you can create. There was an Iraqi woman who did a PhD in chemistry at the University of East Anglia, went back and was the head of Saddam Hussein's chemical weapons projects. In fact, didn't really succeed in making anything, fortunately, but they did gas and bomb the Kurdish people of Iraq with chemical weapons. So chemistry can also create poisons. We can learn too much about what matter's made of and then misuse it. And the same with drugs. You know, people can misuse knowledge and create drugs that cause psychosis or that can, you know, have negative impacts on the human psyche. And so I think chemistry has to be handled with great care, extreme care. And we should always, I think all scientists should swear a Hippocratic oath that they will not misuse their knowledge to harm. The point about the Hippocratic oath in medicine is that you train as a doctor, you learn this really advanced stuff, and then you apply it for healing, benefiting humanity. You give that knowledge away to help heal. Well, I think it should be true of all sciences, which in many ways are just a spin-off from medicine, and that all PhD students like me and everyone else should have to swear a Hippocratic oath. And there are people campaigning for that. There's networks of scientists working for that. I think that should be, you know, put on the top agenda of the world's leaders politically. And it should be true in Russia, America, China, wherever there's advanced science at work. They shouldn't be making instruments of death or misusing chemical knowledge. Look at what happened with the pandemic and the very likely probability that this was a spin-off from tinkering with viruses to make them even more deadly. And that's a misuse of biological knowledge. It's the complete opposite of the Hippocratic Oath. It's misusing this advanced knowledge to then make weapons that can cause this tragedy of the pandemic we all lived through. And there are people, as I speak, you know, inventing those things. Robert Kennedy Jr.'s new book has exposed what he claims is absolute evidence of the Wuhan cover-up, that it was a spill-off from chemical, you know, biological weapons being made in China, but funded by the US government. And Fauci denies it, but it looks like he's lying through his teeth. You know, I suspend judgment, I can't prove it, but read Robert Kennedy's book, he thinks he's proved it. And the point is that we the people should have the right to know this stuff. It shouldn't be done in our name. So this is the misuse of biology and chemistry. And I would say as a philosopher, as a good Aristotelian, that we should be using philosophy for healing and for helping humanity, not harming. And, you know, it's dangerous, this stuff. Okay, that's what I'll say about those two, but they're absolutely fascinating. You can look at the book for more details on the history of these traditions. And it's ongoing research, and in my book, Being and Knowledge, there's a whole section on being knowledge and the sciences in which I've explained, you know, how, because Aristotle defined metaphysics as the study of being as such. And I think there's a lot of wisdom in that definition. So, you know, how can we have knowledge of what is absolute being? That's what I explored in my book on Being and Knowledge. And there's a whole section on science in relation to that. Because science is an attempt to know things, but in a sense it only succeeds by breaking things up into discrete chunks of knowledge. Whereas being itself presents itself to us as a whole, and you know, there's a tension between that, the sort of partiality of sciences versus the wholeness of beingness. And love is associated with the wholeness of things. If you love somebody, you love the whole of them. Or if you love a country or a city or a place or you know, a teaching, it's the whole of it you love. And so I think love is the emotional response that is evoked in people in response to you know, a manifestation of the wholeness of being.